Afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Good morning for those in the US, and good evening for those in Asia. And welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many people here for the 2024 Wordsworth Lecture. For those of you who I haven't met, my name's Stephen Blythe. I'm the principal of the college. I'm delighted to be principal. I've been here 18 months, and it's been such a pleasure meeting so many of our alumni, and I do hope to meet many of you I haven't met it in person. But thank you for joining in this pandemic reminiscent Zoom forum, and I am just delighted to introduce Marion Turner. One of the core priorities for me, and actually great joys for me as principal, is to celebrate our academic mission, excellence in teaching, research, and learning. And very few people embody that more than Marion. She is the Tolkien Professor of English Literature and Languages at LMH. We're very happy that she joined us last year. It's been delight working with Marion. She'll be glad not to be wearing a gown for this lecture. The last lecture we did together was her inaugural lecture as the statutory chair with the Vice Chancellor and the Beddells and Proctors and various finery. Here it's gowns optional. But Marion will be speaking about reimagining Chaucer in the here and now. And I can only recommend the exhibition that Marion has curated, Chaucer in the here and now, at the Western Library. It's on until the 28th of April. It's outstanding, and been very, very positively reviewed. And we're delighted that Marion will be speaking to us. One other thing, I just want to advertise something that will be coming everyone's way shortly, is the next edition of LMH News, and in that there's a wonderful conversation between Marion and Alicia A. Stallings, who is the new Oxford Professor of Poetry and another LMH alum who we've delighted to join the college this year. And there's a wonderful conversation between the two of them. So you'll hear a lot of wonderful stuff from Marion today, and there's more to come. So thank you again for being here on a Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, and Sunday morning, and enjoy the lecture. And Marion, thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see if it works. Yep. Let me start the slideshow. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that, and someone will alert me if they can't. So, as Stephen said, I've recently curated an exhibition that's on at the moment at the Western Library at the Bodleian. Chaucer Here and Now. I'll show you a picture of part of the exhibition. So Chaucer Here and Now, as you may know, Chaucer died in 1400. So what do I mean by thinking about him in the here and now? It's not only about our own here and now. What I try and do in this exhibition is to show how Chaucer has been imagined differently, creatively, in all kinds of ways in every here and now since his death. So every generation, every century reimagines Chaucer in their own here and now. And there's really an extraordinary variety of Chaucers across time. So in some eras, for example, the 19th century, people preferred a serious Chaucer. The kind of tales they liked were didactic stories about female obedience, chivalry, saints' lives. In other eras, such as the 20th century, people liked rude Chaucer, bawdy Chaucer, the stories about sex in a tree and farting out of windows, that kind of Chaucer. Both those Chaucers are available to readers because Chaucer wrote such diversity, such a wide variety of different kinds of texts, different kinds of tales. So the exhibition is a kind of gallop through time. We start with the very earliest manuscripts, and we have got the very earliest Chaucer manuscript in the exhibition. And we go right through to modern films. So it goes, there's Caxton, there's the Cachuera tales, there's very early, gorgeous illuminated manuscripts. And then there's also modern cartoons and puppets, those kinds of things. So the exhibition really allows us to take a long view of 600 plus years of Chaucer coming right up to the present day. So in this talk today, I'm going to take you right across time, but starting with Chaucer's death. The exhibition is not about Chaucer's life, it's about Chaucer's readers. It's about what happened after Chaucer died, how people read him, responded to him, the forms in which his texts were circulated, and the adaptations that people made of his texts. So when Chaucer died, he left all kinds of unfinished texts. He left real chaos. And scribes were very, very irreverent in how they treated those texts. They did not think they must preserve them absolutely. They did all kinds of creative, but also sometimes quite problematic things to the text that had survived. You know, we don't know what order the Canterbury Tales are supposed to be in. Sometimes we don't know what the real text is, because what we have is many different versions of it. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean. So this is a bit of the Cook's Tale. So this is just an example of one of the Canterbury Tales. So this was a tale which Chaucer didn't finish. He left it in the middle of the story, and the last line that he wrote is that it's about a woman, and he says, this woman held for continence a shop, held for the sake of appearance a shop, and swived for her sustenance, and had sex for a living. So she was a prostitute. And that's how it finishes. And in some manuscripts, it just ends with that. And the scribe, the person writing out the manuscript, scribbles along the side. Here's what happens in the very earliest manuscript, the Henguet, which is in the exhibition. He just writes along the side, Chaucer didn't finish this. Of this tale, maketh Chaucer no more. But in this manuscript, another 15th century manuscript, the one that I'm showing you here, the scribe thought, well, that's absolutely rubbish, finishing in the middle of everything like that. So he added another 12 lines. So it's quite hard probably to make out here on the screen, but right in the middle of the screen is that continence, sustenance rhyme. And then there's 12 extra lines in which the scribe finishes it all off and then says, here ended the Cook's Tale. That's the red writing at the bottom there. But those 12 lines are not by Chaucer, and the scribe doesn't signal that they're not by Chaucer. Any reader who doesn't think very closely about how bad the poetry now is will assume it's by Chaucer. This scribe has also censored the manuscript. So that line, swived for his sustenance, the scribe didn't want to write that, didn't want to say had sex for a living. So instead has changed that to played for her sustenance, played. So a kind of metaphorical version of swived. We don't see much censorship in the 15th century. There's tons later in the 18th and 19th century, but this scribe was obviously a little bit reluctant to say something explicit. In another manuscript of the Cook's Tale, and you see this in lots of manuscripts, the scribe just adds another Cook's Tale, pages and pages and pages of something called the Tale of Gamelin. Again, not by Chaucer, but the scribes don't necessarily mind. They just want to round it off, put something in that suits them. So that's the kind of thing that we see scribes doing. And I've taken a few authors around the exhibition. They all kind of turn white when I show them this section of scribes just finishing things off, adding bits of fan fiction, doing what they like to the text. You know, in some ways it's a creative intervention, but in other ways it's a real, it's taking a lot of liberties, of course, with the author and with the role of the author. Here are a couple of further examples of 15th century manuscripts to show you the kinds of things that scribes were doing to Chaucer manuscripts. The one on the left, as you can see, there's two columns of writing. There's the main column, and that's the text. And then there's the scribe's comments written in the margin. Now, this is the Wife of Bath's prologue. So what we often see in manuscripts is that scribes will put little things in columns, in margins next to the text, but mainly they're things like a little pointing finger and this is a good bit, nota bene, or a reference to the source, for example. Where that changes is with the Wife of Bath. So the Wife of Bath is the only secular woman in the pilgrimage, the only woman who is not a nun who tells a tale. And she talks a lot about sex, she challenges the church, she writes about the body. She says a lot of things that make people uncomfortable. As a result, she's interrupted a lot, more than any other pilgrim. But we also see scribes being really uncomfortable about what she says. So the scribes, I call these scribes the mansplaining scribes. What you see here is the scribe writing tons and tons of things in the margin. And what the scribe is doing here is arguing with the wife of Bath. So instead of just referring to little bits of source and so on, he writes reams about why we should not agree with the wife of Bath. He's trying to make the reader listen to his arguments rather than the wife of Bath's arguments by quoting lots and lots of things to try to prove her wrong. That only happens with the wife of Bath, this really excessive noting. But again, you can see here how scribes are trying to intervene in the text. So they are the first critics in some ways, trying to tell people how they should read the text, but in ways that, may or may not be useful. They may seem to bias the reader. It's a bit like when you get a library book out and people have written lots of things in it or underlined it. And it's quite interesting to see how they've read it, but it biases your own reading when you see certain bits that other people have flagged up as important or problematic. The other manuscript that I'm showing you here is a manuscript in which the scribe is really trying to emphasize Chaucer's importance. So Chaucer in the 15th century starts to be seen as an author figure. So in his own life, circulation is, it's quite minor. It's really his friends and his friends' friends. More people are reading him in the 15th century. And once a generation has passed since his death, more and more scribes and readers are starting to realize that attaching Chaucer's name to the manuscript is going to make people more interested in it. He's becoming a person with more authority. So you can see here the elaborate Chaucer written in big letters at the top, the little author portrait at the bottom showing the author with his book. So Chaucer's starting to be seen as more important. Some manuscripts, such as the one on the left here, are relatively scruffy. But we also see some manuscripts that are absolutely beautiful. So this is another Bodleian manuscript with these gorgeous illuminations. This is an illumination of the poem, The Complaint of Mars. It's an image with Jupiter at the top, Mars and Venus lower down. And some manuscripts have these really high production values where you can see a lot of money is being spent on these manuscripts. This is a household, someone commissioning it, who really wants something that's going to make the commissioner look good. He's got this gorgeous, beautiful manuscript. And there are several like this where the colors, even today, 600 years on, just look absolutely stunning. And you can really see how lavish medieval manuscript culture is. But again, just seeing these few manuscripts here on this PowerPoint hopefully shows you the variety of manuscripts at the time. Today, if we were all in a book club together reading a text, we'd all be reading the same text. That's just not what it's like in manuscript culture before print. People will be reading radically different texts. They might look much more beautiful than others. Some will also have actually different texts in them, sometimes just small differences of words or a few lines. Sometimes wholly different tales will be put in. Often the tales will be in different orders because we don't know what order the Canterbury Tales were supposed to be in. Chaucer died leaving a mass of different fragments, different collections of tales in different bits, a few here, a few there. And so although sometimes we see scribes taking a lot of liberties, they also had to make some decisions. They had to do something to make this into a text that could be bound up and circulated in a certain form. So because Chaucer didn't make these decisions, we see a text in process when he died. As the 15th century wore on, print, of course, arrived in England, and that really changed the here and now for how Chaucer's texts could be circulated and how all texts could be circulated. Caxton set up his printing press in Westminster, right next to London, in 1476. And that meant that texts could now be circulated in greater numbers. And the first major text that Caxton printed, the first big text that was printed in English, was the Canterbury Tales. So Caxton published that in 1476, and then he published a second edition in 1483. And the text that you see on the left here is Caxton's second edition. I have the first and the second in the exhibition side by side. And what you can see in these early prints is that when the technology of print arrived, Printers didn't think we've got this shiny new technology, we must show everyone how amazing and different it is. Instead, they thought we must reassure people that we can still make our texts look fairly like manuscripts. So early print doesn't look that different from manuscripts, that the typesetting looks quite like handwriting. Sometimes pages are elaborately decorated by hand. It's a kind of reassuring thing for people that print can still look beautiful. And it's a bit like, I think, turning the pages technology today, that people read on screens, but they have software that mimics the feeling of turning pages on a book. People are actually anxious about new technology. They want to make sure that they've still got their connection to the past. But what also happens in print culture, it's not all good. I think that we're used to thinking of print as an amazing technology, which of course it is. It allows books to be made much more quickly, much more cheaply, to be circulated to many more people. But the other thing that happens in print is that book production becomes much more commercial. So whereas in manuscript culture, an individual can think, well, I want to have a text which has a few Canterbury Tales in it, and then I want a poem about doing the laundry. This is a real medieval example of a poem. And then I want a recipe for some medicines. And then I want a devotional text. Someone could have all that. They could commission a manuscript that has all the things that they want. Some of those things might be quite obscure. But once a printer is in charge of what's going to be printed, they are thinking essentially, what's going to sell? What do people want? Now, Chaucer was kind of benefited from that. People knew, his texts had remained really popular in the 15th century. There are many, many manuscripts. We know that people were really enjoying reading Chaucer. And also, Chaucer benefited from being in the southeast. I myself am from the northeast, so I recognize the gross unfairness that always has happened, since about this time, in terms of what happens depending on what region you're from. Because Caxton wanted to print things in the East Midland dialect, the London dialect, and Chaucer was writing in that dialect. So he benefited from that. Whereas something like Gawain and the Green Knight, also an incredibly brilliant poem written at the same time as Chaucer, but written in the northwestern dialect from the Cheshire area, that didn't get printed till the 19th century. People like Caxton weren't interested in printing things from the north in particular. So as the late 15th century wore on, the 16th century, Chaucer's texts were printed over and over again. The middle version here that I've shown you is from 1532. And hopefully you can see there that it says on it, the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, newly printed. Now, this print by Thynne, this is the first time that any vernacular author, vernacular author being someone writing in English, the first time that a vernacular author gets given a works, a complete works. Before then, when any printer printed a works, an oeuvre, they'd only done that for Latin authors. So someone like Virgil or Ovid, their oeuvres would be printed, their works, but not someone who was writing in English. So that's a real milestone in how people were now thinking about English writing, that now readers, printers, publishers can see that someone writing in English can have a kind of authority. So Chaucer is being seen as much more authoritative because at this point, he's been dead for long enough to have authority. In the medieval and early modern period, and still to a certain extent today, I think, when people have been dead for a while, they are given more authority. Their writings are seen to have stood the test of time. So Chaucer had now kind of starting to get that status of a real author figure that we saw starting to happen in manuscripts, but it really explodes in the 16th century. So now he has his works, and then the big picture that you can see there, that's the frontispiece of Spate's edition from 1598. And this is really when we start to see Chaucer as this author with a capital A. And this edition, the late 16th century edition, is the edition that people such as Shakespeare would have been very familiar with. This was a very influential edition, Spate's. Now, hopefully you can make out there that at the top of that page, it says the progeny of Geoffrey Chaucer. So the children of Geoffrey Chaucer, the descendants of Geoffrey Chaucer. And then there's the giant picture of Chaucer. Lots of people are familiar with this image, and it's based on an earlier image from the early 15th century. But this image, giant Chaucer, looking quite old, quite serious, patriarchal old man, holding his rosary and his pen, with a tomb beneath him and family trees around him. This is Father Chaucer. This really is not how people thought about Chaucer in his own lifetime. You know, when I wrote a biography of Chaucer a few years ago, I wrote about the fact that the first life record we have of Chaucer tells us about what clothes he was wearing when he was a teenager. He was a very fashionable teenager, and his first employer bought him some skin-tight leggings and a very short tunic. He was this fashion icon. He was a young man who traveled all over Europe, wrote experimental poetry, was innovative, did all kinds of interesting jobs, you know, prisoner of war, MP, invented new poetic lines. He wasn't this sober, serious, rosary holding patriarch that became very familiar to people, particularly from this kind of image. So it really entrenches one particular kind of idea of the author. Now, as I mentioned, it's headed with this progeny, descendants of Geoffrey Chaucer. And on the right, you can see Chaucer's own family tree. But on the left, we have the royal family tree. And it goes right down to Henry VII at the bottom. I'm pointing at it, but I realize you can't see what I'm pointing at. But at the bottom there on the left, Henry, King of England, Henry VII. Now, Henry VII is not descended from Chaucer. He is descended from Chaucer's sister-in-law. So at the very top, under the progeny of Geoffrey Chaucer, is Chaucer's father-in-law. And then one branch, one daughter who married Chaucer, Chaucer's family tree. And then the other branch on the left is, in fact, Chaucer's sister-in-law's descendants. So Chaucer's sister-in-law was someone called Catherine Swynford, who was the long-term mistress of John of Gaunt. So for 20 years, she was the mistress of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. At the very end of his life, John of Gaunt then married her. Now, they already had 4 illegitimate children. Eventually, he married her. She was much lower class than him. It caused a massive scandal. He had their 4 children retrospectively legitimated by the Pope and by Act of Parliament. There was a clause which said that they shouldn't have any right to the throne. But nonetheless, every one of our monarchs since Henry VII has been descended from them, because these are the Beauforts, very appropriate for thinking about LMH. You can see on there, Lady Margaret Beaufort. So we go down, so they were the illegitimate line, retrospectively legitimated. And as I say, we go, so they are connected with Chaucer by marriage, but not by blood. We go down through Lady Margaret, down through Henry VII, and all of our monarchs come from that line. So the effect of this image is to make it look like Chaucer is not only the father of poetry, but the father of the nation. You know, we see here progeny of Geoffrey Chaucer, his own family, the royal family tree, and it really entrenches this idea of him as patriarch looking down on the nation as a whole. Really strange way of thinking about this kind of edgy middle class poet, you know, son of a merchant, son of a wine merchant. He's become a very different figure by this time. As we race on through the centuries, we move on to what I'm calling it here, the age of censorship, a time of rewriting Chaucer. So I'm talking here about, I mean, mainly the 18th century, a bit earlier. And what we see here is lots of different things going on. So the example on the left here is a rewriting of Chaucer, a kind of translation of Chaucer. So this is Alexander Pope's translation in the very early 18th century of the Wife of Bath's prologue. So when Pope translated the prologue, he didn't think much of it. He found it quite vulgar. So when he translated it, he took out all the bits that are about the body, sexual desire, where she talks about her genitals and liking to have sex in the morning. All those kinds of things get removed. As a result, there is very little left. So Alexander Pope's version of the Wife of Bath's prologue is half the length of Chaucer's version because he's taken all the rude bits out. At the same time, John Dryden wrote his fables, and he says twice in the preface that he wanted to translate the Wife of Bath's prologue, but he simply did not dare because it is too licentious. Instead, he did translate the tale, which he changes a bit, but the prologue, he says it's too licentious. He just doesn't dare. And so both Dryden and Pope are kind of aware that 18th century taste is different from earlier taste. And at this time, we start to see a lot of people being quite anxious about the bawdiness, the vulgarity, the bits of Chaucer that are rude. And so we see people kind of saying, well, of course, he was a great poet, but, you know, he was of his time, and that time was just a bit rough and ready, a bit rude compared with the polite 18th century. At the same time, Chaucer is still being very widely read, and he was kind of, I think these authors, they decided they could cut him some slack. You know, they still saw his benefits and his brilliance, even while taking out the bits that they didn't like. What we also see at this time is spin-off texts. So their contemporary, Dryden and Pope's contemporary, John Gay, wrote a play called The Wife of Bath, for example, in 1713, and then rewrote it in 1731. I've also shown you here a ballad. So this ballad dates from earlier. So the first reference to it is 1600, but it's repeatedly rewritten right through to the 19th century. So it's a spin-off text where people are now taking Chaucer and using his tales as inspiration for their own new texts. So this ballad tells us about what happens when the wife of Bath dies and gets to Heaven's Gate. Adam comes and says she can't come in. She argues with him, telling him all about his own flaws. And then Jacob comes, she argues with him. Patriarch after patriarch arrives. She sends them all packing until eventually Christ arrives and ultimately lets her in. Now, this ballad, again, was heavily censored. It was burnt, the printers were put in prison. But nonetheless, despite that censorship, people kept on writing new versions. And the versions changed, sometimes to fit local contexts. So, for instance, there's one version, which is The Wife of Baith, Beith, which is a town in Scotland, as we see it being rewritten to fit a Scottish context. We also see that in earlier manuscripts where we see there's a manuscript where all the spellings have been changed to Scottish spellings, for instance, because sometimes scribes and now printers and writers, balladeers, they try to think about what their local audience will like and to make the text fit their audience rather than thinking that the audience has to like the text as it originally is or as it is when it comes to them. So this ballad is a great example of how texts survive even when people try to censor them. They keep coming back, which I think is a very kind of pleasing thing, that censorship often doesn't work. You know, people will keep bootleg copies or they'll remember it. This is a ballad that people would remember. They would sing it and then write it down later. You can't censor what's in someone's mind to that extent. In the Victorian era, where that ballad is still circulating, we see lots of other really interesting things happening to Chaucer's texts. And, you know, the Victorians, as I'm sure you can imagine, had a lot to say about Chaucer. So I'm going to talk about a few different trends. What I'm showing you here is William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones' Kelmscott Chaucer. Absolutely beautiful book, really gorgeous. And it's a real high point of Victorian medievalism, pre-Raphaelite medievalism, an idealization of the medieval. So what you can see here, the Kelmscott Chaucer, probably the most famous edition of Chaucer since Caxton's in 1476. One interesting thing that you can see here is that although this is the late 19th century, William Morris has tried to make this look like a medieval manuscript, right? It doesn't really look like a modern printed edition. It's gorgeously decorated, very similar to the kinds of things that you see in 15th century manuscripts. That beautiful initial in the little box, the W of Wan, again, that's how initials are decorated in medieval manuscripts. So it's a homage to medieval manuscript decoration and craft and ability. It also puts forward a very particular image of the medieval that tells us nothing about the medieval era, but tells us quite a lot about how Victorians such as Morris and Burne-Jones were thinking about the Victorian period. You can see there the picture of the poet. So on the right-hand side, this beautiful picture of Chaucer as a poet. What you can see there is the poet on his own in an idyllic pastoral landscape with a fountain and trees, thinking about his poetry. That is not how Chaucer lived. Chaucer mainly lived in the city of London. He lived above Aldgate, the gate through which the rebels came in the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. He lived in a city amongst furnaces and abattoirs where coins were being made in the mint. He worked in the customs house on the Wool Quay in the city of London, at the heart of trade, watching the ships come in laden with products from all over the world, sending the bales of wool out to be sold all over Europe. So he was at the heart of a really busy city for much of his life. And he was then doing his accounts at the customs house, going home in the city and writing his poems in his rooms by candlelight. He was not standing around in the countryside in a garden contemplating a fountain and writing his poetry. This image is not about the medieval era, it's about a response to the Industrial Revolution. So what we can see here is Victorian writers thinking about the problems of industrialization, and thinking and imagining the medieval era as this idealized, simpler time before industrialization, when everything was much more beautiful and more straightforward. So it really misrepresents Chaucer and the medieval in this attempt to differentiate it from the current situation in the late 19th century, post-industrialization. And that's one trend that we see quite dominant in Victorian medievalism. One of the other ways in which Chaucer was being responded to in the 19th century in particular was that there was an enormous trend for children's Chaucers, so children's versions of Chaucer. There are dozens and dozens of these. I've got a fabulous collection of them in the exhibition. So I've just given you here a few examples. They tend to be really nicely illustrated as well, so that they're really interesting visually. So children's Chaucers are the kinds of Chaucers that I mentioned right at the beginning. They are a very specific kind of Chaucer. The children's adaptations never contain the miller's tale, the reeve, the cook, the shipman, the merchant, those tales which are fablio tales about adultery, husbands being humiliated, trickery winning out. They're rude. They feature all kinds of fairly shocking scenes. They don't make it into children's Chaucers. Instead, we see often the nun's priest tale, which is a beast fable about the fox and the rooster. We see the clerk and the man of law, stories about female obedience to husbands and fathers with a religious message. We see the knight's tale about chivalry, those kinds of tales. What we quite often see is women increasingly involved in this adaptation. So the third example along there, which I know it's hard to make out, but it's a frontispiece which a mother put of her son, little Lionel, and she dedicates the book to him. And you quite often in introductions to children's Chaucers, the editors will talk about the idea that women, mothers, should be reading these with their sons in particular in the nursery, and that reading these editions of Chaucer are going to help their children to become wise and good people. I mean, really extraordinary for anyone that's read Chaucer in any detail, the idea that reading his texts is going to help people to emulate these wonderful ethical characters in there. But the children's Chaucers, there are all kinds of really interesting stories behind them. So in one, for example, there's a wonderful introduction in which Furnival, a very famous medievalist in the 19th century, he writes the introduction, and he says in it, he's trying to encourage the readers, the young boys, to think that Chaucer is going to be just like them. He thinks that's going to be a way to these schoolboys' hearts. So he says in this introduction, Chaucer was plucky and slippy at football, hockey, and all other sports. Cricket was not then known. It's completely made up. There is no evidence for Chaucer, the good or bad footballer, no evidence whatsoever. But he wants to make his Victorian schoolboy readers think, oh, Chaucer was just like me. And I really love that detail that he adds, cricket was not then known, because he clearly thinks, oh, my reader's going to be thinking, but what about cricket? Was he a batsman or a bowler? How was he at the wicket? So he inserts there, he didn't know cricket. Cricket wasn't invented then. And that also gives a kind of illusion of realism, makes you think, okay, well, he's not prepared to make things up. So this comment about the football must be true, which of course it isn't. But one of my other kind of favorite stories around the children's Chaucer is on the far right of this image here, the books for the bairns. So the books for the bairns, really interesting example of a children's Chaucer. So these books for the bairns were published by W.T. Stead, and they were really cheap versions of Chaucer and there were lots of other things in that series as well, kind of classic literature made simpler for children, but they were for poor children. They were simple versions, priced at only a penny. But this guy, W.T. Stead, as well as publishing these cheap books for the bairns, he was also a campaigner, and he was a newspaperman. He campaigned particularly against child prostitution. And he set up a sting operation in which he pretended to procure a child in order to expose the trade in child prostitutes. It in some ways backfired on him in that he ended up in prison for procuring this child, which he had not done, but he ended up in prison. However, his campaigning resulted in the age of consent being raised from 13 to 16. So really interesting guy. He then went down on the Titanic. So he really lived a full life. Fascinating guy. So that's another thing that's happening in the Victorian period. this Chaucer really going into the nursery at the same time as Chaucer goes out to the empire. So we also see in this era various different editions where the people in the introduction say Chaucer should be sent out to both hemispheres. They imply that Chaucer will promote English values in a way that imperialists would be pleased with. So Chaucer's being sent out around the world while also kind of going into this kind of intimate nursery schoolroom atmosphere. And as I mentioned, we particularly get more women adapting Chaucer at this time. So it's important to note that women have always read Chaucer. That image on the left is just an image, a medieval image of women reading, and there's lots of these in manuscripts. This is one of my favorites because this is Saint Anne, who's just given birth to the Virgin Mary, hands her over to a maid and then hops back into bed with a book. Now, of course, we're really supposed to think that this is a religious book, but I like to imagine it as something like Jilly Cooper. Some of the other things that I'm showing you here are the earliest female illustrator of Chaucer. So this is Lady Diana Beauclerk, who illustrated Chaucer at the very end of the 18th century. And then I'm also showing you there a 19th century novel by Maria Edgeworth, a very well-known novelist who wrote a novel, The Modern Griselda, which was a spin-off from The Clerk's Tale. So we increasingly see women involved in reading Chaucer, in writing spin-off texts, and then as we get into the 20th century, women of course become involved in scholarly work on Chaucer, editing Chaucer, doing all kinds of biographical work and other kinds of scholarly work on Chaucer. Now in the 20th century, the main idea of Chaucer that people had was bawdy Chaucer, that Chaucer, it was no longer Victorian, didactic, serious Chaucer, it was sexualized Chaucer, rude Chaucer. And Pasolini's film is the example of this. So Pasolini's film, so from the 1970s, really sums this up. In his film, he dramatizes 8 of the Canterbury Tales. They're all about sex. Some of them in the original Chaucer are not about sex, but Pasolini inserts all kinds of extra sex scenes to make it, I mean, a really one-sided kind of text. And it's a real travesty of Chaucer's aesthetic vision, because his film, Pasolini's film, The Canterbury Tales, focuses so narrowly on this one aspect, whereas the point of Chaucer is diversity, variety. So this sex-only version of Chaucer is just as distorting as the Victorian didactic serious-only version of Chaucer. They both really misrepresent what Chaucer is doing, where you have to see the variety of different kinds of texts, ideas, voices within Chaucer to try to understand something of what he's trying to do and what he's trying to say about both society and poetics. In the 20th century, we really see Chaucer going into lots of different media. I was talking there about Pasolini's film. There are also other films that I think are more interesting and more surprising in a way. So here I'm showing you a Canterbury Tale. So this is a Powell and Pressburger film from the 1940s. So this is a wartime film. Absolutely fascinating film. I know I don't have time to go into it in detail here. So I think the only thing I'll say is, apart from I really do recommend it, it's so bizarre and strange. So I suppose, yeah, I'll say a couple of quick things about it. One is that it really focuses on a beautiful image of the English landscape. It emphasizes the idea of the pilgrimage through the gorgeousness of the landscape near Canterbury in Kent. And I think partly it's trying to emphasize the idea of this is what we are fighting for in the 1940s, in the Second World War. It tries to get across this idea of Chaucer as really being part of the English landscape, of a rural idea of Englishness. Again, you know, a bit like going back to William Morris's idea of a kind of pastoral ideal. The other thing that's very comic in this film, though it's not supposed to be comic, is that this was a film that was shown in America when GIs were coming over to England in large numbers. And so the film also tries to educate them on English life. So every now and then in the film, there is an American soldier in the film, and every now and then he'll say things like, well, I know better now than to drink coffee in the morning. I know that over here we all have to have tea. Then there's a great scene about kind of how to make a pot of tea and how to pour it and all those kinds of things. So it's very funny on a kind of on how it's being used to kind of teach people about modern English life at that time as well. But it is fascinating on how Chaucer is being distorted and made to fit a particular idea of Englishness. Another screen example of what happens to Chaucer in the 20th century is the animated tales. And there's a couple, if anyone who is able to go to the exhibition, a couple of these are on a screen and you can choose to watch one of them with headphones. But I'm showing you here kind of scenes from 4 different of the animations. So the animations put together several of the Canterbury Tales. But I hope what you can see here is that they use different animation techniques. So the director, Meyerson, employ different animators and different animation studios to make different segments of his animated version. So sometimes it's stop motion, sometimes it's line drawing, for example. And I think it's really clever because it mirrors the different forms and genres of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but does that in visual form. So you do really feel like you're going into very different worlds, different aesthetic visions as you go into the different tales, different color palettes, all of those kinds of things. So I think it's a really kind of interesting version of the Canterbury Tales. You know, it's very each one is very short, but I think really effective in many ways, and you do get that sense of contrast between the different tales. As we get into the 21st century, so you know that I'm going to finish soon, just another couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about the last 20 odd years of what's been happening in our own Chaucer here and now, which I think has been fascinating, because one of the major things that's happened in our Chaucer here and now is that Chaucer has been taken up by many poets and writers as a poet with something to say to the contemporary diasporic refugee experiences. So in particular, we see lots of contemporary Black poets and writers who've written new versions of Chaucer. So I'm giving you 3 examples on this screen. So Refugee Tales, Patience Like Bagby, the Cachoeira Tales. I'll say a little bit about them in a moment, but I think that there are 2 reasons why people have really taken Chaucer up in this way. So one is that the opening of the Canterbury Tales and the Canterbury Tales as a whole is all about the joys of free travel. You know, the Canterbury Tales opens with this gorgeous vision of traveling through the landscape in April time. This idea that people long to go on pilgrimage, to travel through the landscape, to experience that literal and metaphorical travel. So that kind of travel experience is set against forced migrations of all kinds as a kind of as a contrast, as a sign of how humanly problematic it is, the way that people are forced into these journeys or forced into indefinite detention as well. The other reason why I think Chaucer has been taken up in this way by all kinds of diasporic groups is that one of the key points of the Canterbury Tales is that we should listen to marginalized voices, that we shouldn't just listen to the voice of the powerful. We should listen to all kinds of different people, that everyone should have the right to tell their own story. And that is, of course, a very powerful message for people who are trying to exactly to do that, to bring forward the voice of the oppressed, of the disenfranchised. So, as I said, I've given you here a few different examples. Refugee Tales. So that's a project that started in 2016 and has gone on since then. Every year, a group of refugees and a group of writers walk part of the pilgrimage route together. The refugees tell their stories to the writers, who tell them back to them and then write them up in these volumes of poetry and other forms as well, which are closely inspired in some cases by the Canterbury Tales. In other cases, some of the individual stories just take the tales as a jumping off point. But in some of them, lines from the tales are really interwoven through the refugees' experience. The second example that I've given here in the middle is just a picture of Patience Like Bagby, a wonderful poet who wrote a version of the Canterbury Tales called Telling Tales. So she is a Nigerian British poet. She sets some of the tales into all kinds of multicultural contexts. She's also, I mean, she's a brilliant poet. So she tells every tale. Almost no adapters do that. They usually miss out the ones that are seen as either too problematic or too boring. She tells all of them in all different poetic forms. And some of them are very traditional forms. There's a mirror poem, for example. There's a crown of sonnets. But some of them are very contemporary. So one of them is in texting. One of them is inspired by grime music, for example.
Then the final example here is from the Cachoeira Tales. So this is by Marilyn Nelson, a Black American poet. And you can see there in that quotation that she's drawing very closely on Chaucer. So Chaucer's tale, the Canterbury Tales general prologue begins, "One that Aprila with his sure suitor, the droct of March, hath pierced to the rooter, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fleur." She changes that into, "When April rains had drenched the root of what March headlines had foreseen as drought." So very closely mirroring, bringing into the present. And then she inverts the idea of the free travel when she talks about the reverse diaspora. "I'd planned a pilgrimage to Africa." So she's setting into her own personal context, but drawing closely on Chaucer's tales. My final example of recent Black British responses is Zadie Smith's Wife of Willesden. So Zadie Smith, contemporary Black British novelist and poet. This is her first play, which premiered only in 2021 in the Kiln in London, but has since then gone to America as well. So Zadie Smith takes the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale and transposes it. So the Wife of Bath becomes a 21st century woman of Caribbean heritage living in northwest London, Alvita. The tale is transferred from Arthurian Britain into 18th century plantations of Jamaica, set now amongst a community of Maroons descended from enslaved people. So she changes the setting, makes it much more global, makes it relevant in new ways, but at the same time sticks very closely to Chaucer's text, uses Chaucer's form, the iambic pentameter, and translates what Chaucer is saying really very, very closely, while showing this new kind of relevance in different settings. To conclude, I think that kind of global response to Chaucer is entirely fitting to what Chaucer himself was doing. I'm returning in this picture, this last slide here, to the exhibition. And what you can see here is the center of the exhibition. There is one case which is about medieval multilingualism. And in the foreground, there's a Boccaccio manuscript, there's a Dante manuscript to the left. This central case shows the fact that Chaucer was not himself reading much English poetry. He was reading poetry in French, in Latin, above all in Italian. He was reading and translating texts that he knew had themselves been translated from Arabic texts, for example. He was a global writer who was immersed in European and even broader contexts. The case behind that is about modern multilingualism, it includes translations of Chaucer into Ukrainian, Farsi, Hebrew, French, Esperanto, Russian, Brazilian Portuguese, all kinds of different languages. And I do think that the modern taking up of Chaucer all over the world and thinking about Chaucer as a global writer is really appropriate to who he really was. He wasn't the father of English literature, that authoritative figure that we saw in the 16th century print. He was an edgy, diasporic, global poet, really set in international contexts. And that is back where he is today as well. Thank you so much for listening.
Marion, thank you so very much for that absolutely fascinating whirlwind tour through the centuries of Chaucer's work. It's really interesting to see how it's been adapted to suit the purpose and tastes, I guess, of the audience over the time, and also great to see the link, of course, to Lady Margaret as well. Any questions, please do put them into the chat now. We have got about 10 minutes to make the most of Marion, and I hope everyone will go and see the exhibition, which runs until the 28th of April at the Bodleian.